Okay, welcome to the Sustainable Solutions Workshop, webinar number 4. The agenda for this workshop, this is Marie Bourgeois speaking. I'll be your presenter today along with Diana Hammer. The intent of the class this week is to introduce our student intern, Sheridan. We want to discuss the homework from class 3, tell a story, talk about eyesight sharing. We'll be presenting several case studies to illustrate points in the biomimicry methodology, do a review of the function and discover phase. We'll look at how to abstract design principles, discuss the class 4 homework, and we'll answer questions and comments. I'm not able to advance the slides. Let's see what happens. Okay. There we go. So Sheridan, would you like to introduce yourself? She's our student intern in the Helena, Montana office. Sheridan, can you unmute yourself and take it away? Sheridan, we're not hearing you. Are you able to speak, or should I present you? Sure, she's not sure how to unmute yourself. You're on the web, so you may not, you didn't call in.
She actually doesn't have an audio connection at all, it looks like. Sheridan,
right.
If you're able to see your control panel, there is an audio tab, and so toggle that open, and it will give you a choice of using your telephone or using your mic and speakers. And if you choose mic and speakers and it doesn't work, it may be that your computer that you're using just isn't equipped. And so just toggle it back to telephone, and it will give you some call-in information. And so just follow that. And there's also a chat pane.
Okay, thanks, Mary. Well,
sure.
While Sheridan's trying to connect, why don't I go on to the next slide, and Sheridan, once we finish with the next slide, I'll come back to you and see if you can unmute yourself. There we go. Diana was going to present some information on different kinds of communication tools that the teams could use to connect, because we identified that teams were having a hard time connecting. Diana, would you like to speak to this? It looks like Diana's offline. So this slide is included in the PDF of the slides that we presented for the workshop that will be posted on Peaks to Prairie. So here's a wide variety of different kinds of ways to do virtual team meetings and virtual collaboration. So we invite you to use these tools. So let's go back to Sheridan and see if she was able to connect. Sheridan, are you able to speak to us? Maybe not yet. So let me introduce Sheridan Cook. She's a summer intern at the US EPA Montana office in Helena. She's from the University of Montana, Missoula, and was awarded a Bachelor's of Art in Environmental Study with a focus on sustainable agriculture. So Sheridan's contact information is presented here and also in the homework, and her normal work hours. The work that Sheridan's going to be doing is to help with organizing the in-person session and also helping you as teams to conduct your biological research, your discover phase. So when we go through tips on finding biological information in today's webinar, just keep in mind that Sheridan's there to help you, and she's a skilled researcher, and she'll have a lot of value to add to the projects. So what I want to do now is just to review the sustainability workshop team's selected functions, and as I call on each team, what I'd like you to do is somebody from the team speak up, confirm that this is in fact, the function that your team will be looking at and tell us a story. That was this week's homework. So let's start with the climate change team. Is someone online from the climate change team that could speak up? Anyone? Maybe not. So their function is, how does nature adapt to changing water availability? So by this function, it's a function that nature certainly achieves, and this team will have some ability to look at that function. For Team Communicate, is there someone online for Team Communicate? So the function that Team Communicate selected was, how does nature communicate? And they had a debate back and forth between team members if they wanted to look at how nature communicates between species, so they could get sustainability and biomimicry messages out to diverse groups, or should they focus on how does nature communicate to the young, as in environmental education programs for young people. The votes were very close, almost 50-50, so I put both of those functions here because sometimes when you ask a question like, how does nature communicate, this team might come across biological information that informs both of these functions. And as you'll see in an example that we're going to present later in the webinar, having more than one function is doable, and so we left both of these functions on there. So next we'll go to Team Lifeblood. Is there someone on from this team online who would like to present a story today? Well, we're striking out 3 for 3 here. So Team Lifeblood also had a difficult time really deciding what their actual function was. And what they came up with was, how does nature foster a connection and maintain symbiotic relationships? And their challenge is to better connect the residents of the reservation to the river that runs through the reservation in Montana. So they're going to be focusing on better ways to reconnect people. Team Disturbandettes, someone on the line who would like to talk about this team?
Hello, can you all hear me?
Great, Matt. So your function is, how does nature manage extreme amounts of water, both physically and chemically? And do you have a story to tell us about your team's progress?
Yeah, so I guess I'll start with kind of the structure of the course. So, I mean, it's kind of online communication and stuff like that, and clearly we can experience some technical difficulties in doing stuff like that. And so, just as a group work project, it's been kind of challenging to coordinate with each other, to have meetings, and where everyone actually shows up, or has access to the programs that we're using to communicate. And so from that perspective, I think there's a lot of learning going on how to do stuff like this for some people, which is great. And so we have to, that's been teaching us a lot as a group how to work in this way online, basically. I guess the tools that we are using are the best that we can use in the capacity of this course, because we're not all in the same place. So I think as a baseline, that's our story of just organizing. As relates to biomimicry, our general topic was disturbance, and we kind of landed on flooding or water as the disturbance, because a few of us are in Colorado and we're mostly experiencing water issues from the floods and stuff, and so we thought that would be appropriate. And so we wanted to kind of, in my eyes, and me and Tom and Ted discussed this on our last meeting, we were discussing the different types of water disturbance, where if you look at the Boulder Creek, for example, during the flood a few years ago, there was one high volume and flow and mass and energy that was torrenting down that destroyed roads, destroyed plants, destroyed everything, right? So there's um, a physical aspect to that water. But there's also, if you just have slowly standing water, like behind a dam or something, that there's not a lot of force associated with that water, but there's just simply a lot of water. And so we kind of thought of there's kind of two potentially different but also interconnected ways to look at it, of both physical connection and chemical connection. So, how does nature physically make sure it doesn't get ripped out during like huge amounts of flooding, and also how does it deal with huge amounts of water chemically? And so those are kind of where we've narrowed our focus. And we're our last meeting we discussed looking at the Amazon basin, which as a great example for plants that can deal with huge amounts of water for half the year and then much less water for the rest. And so there are definitely some chemical methods going on. I'm not familiar with the amount of influx of water to that region, so physically, plants physically adapted to dealing with huge amounts of moving water. I'm just not familiar enough with the ecosystem there. So that's kind of where we're at, and we hope to find solutions that address either both or one of these subtopics of physically or chemically. So that's where we're at.
Well, thanks, Matt. That's a great summary. And just a couple of comments. I know that one of the most difficult things for me working in remote team dynamics is both connecting in a remote setting, and I know that many of you don't know each other, and that makes it even more difficult. But also, it's very difficult to work across disciplines, and having the patience to address each other's needs and to really take the attitude that when a different discipline is presenting an idea in a way that just is very foreign to you, it's an opportunity to learn how that person thinks and how the way they view the world, the lens that they bring to the problem solving, really is a benefit if you can overcome the frustration of having someone think about something in such a different way. So thanks for that update. I think that looking at both of these functions will give a lot of really valuable information.
Great, thank you.
So let's talk about Eyesight. So you've been asked to visit your Eyesight once a week to practice your observation skills. It's worth noting how your experience with this exercise changes over time. Think about jotting down in your journal what aspects of the practice you enjoy or what aspects you find really challenging. Personally, I find it very challenging to actually sit somewhere for 20 minutes, and so it's been a real kind of meditative learning experience for me to take time to just sit quietly and let nature does its business. It's likely at the end of the biomimicry workshop you'll be a fabulous observer, actively looking for eyesight opportunities everywhere you go. So I'll share my eyesight experience for this month. A lot's been happening in nature as spring comes forth. I do most of my eyesight work at my garden, and this month I noticed a lot of pollinators coming to my plants, and I wonder how they interact with these food species that have been so changed by human selection. I hope that all of you have been visiting your Eyesight and relearning how to observe nature with childlike curiosity. And is there anyone online who'd like to share an Eyesight experience with the class? Just unmute your microphone and speak up, or enter your information in your chat box. Anybody? Well, keep looking, observing nature. Okay. Go ahead, Matt.
I can talk.
Sure.
I mean, yeah, I have a garden as well in the back, and I guess I've noticed over the last, I guess, month or so, there are these I guess these it's kind of gross. There's these maggots or something that keep falling out of the one of the trees, and they kind of fall into the back patio. And but beforehand, I realized that there were these robins that were always just around, and they would not leave. And I was curious why I would always go outside and I would see these like few robins just hanging out in the backyard, and and then I finally understood, probably why they're there is because there's all this food falling from the trees, and they would just come down to the ground and pick them up. So that was interesting to
Hmm.
observe. And I also just put like a huge bunch of mulch down in the backyard, and I've noticed that the amount of flies have increased substantially. And I don't know if that's just due to like surface area for maggots, or it's probably those those maggot flies that have landed and survived, I guess, from the robins, and they're making their way into the compost or something and growing up in safe environments. So that's
Well,
been
that's a
interesting.
great story. Thanks for sharing, Matt. I wonder if the robins think you're gardening for maggots just for them. It sounds like. Okay, great idea. So we wanted to present a case study today. Diana, are you able to get online and talk about the Columbia Forest Products and Blue Mussels case study?
It looks like she's been on and off 2 or 3 times. I just wonder if she's having some kind of technical
I'm
issues.
wondering, are you on, Diana? Can you hear us? This was a case study that Diana specifically researched. So what I'll do is, Diana, if you're able to join us a little bit later, we'll come back to this slide and you can tell us your case study. Okay, let's move on. So we've received several questions about the function and the discover phase of the biomimicry methodology that was presented in the last webinar. To address these questions, we'll present details of the challenge that Boulder's Open Space and Mountain Park brought to nature through the use of the biomimicry methodology. We hope this will serve to clarify how your team can identify the right function and begin to discover nature's wisdom to solve your environmental challenges. So today, Boulder citizens enjoy over 45,000 acres of open space land in and around the city. An extensive trail system is available for hikers, horseback riders, bicyclists, and others to enjoy the designated trails. With an annual visitation of 5.3 million visits per year, almost double any national park, maintenance is becoming increasingly important to preserve the quality of Boulder's open space and mountain parks. Lynn Sullivan, their Chief of Interpretations, participated in EPA's biomimicry workshop in 2012. Her vision is to bring biomimicry to open space and mountain parks, and through this action, demonstrate to the City of Boulder the value of incorporating technology. So you can see from their mission that OSMP already has a connection to nature. The key to success of this project was to bring senior leaders on board. We needed resources, both financial and use of employees' time, in order to look at an innovative design process. This was especially important as the city had just experienced a 1,000-year rain event in September 2013, and OSMP was significantly impacted by this flood. Employees were overworked due to the reconstruction of damaged trails and roads. Demonstrated ability to work across all disciplines. In other words, she was liked and respected by her managers and peers. A perfect person to champion the biomimicry approach. She identified a key leverage, that employees loved the land that had been impacted by the flood and wanted to find better solutions to trail and road surfacing so that it could withstand such severe weather events in the future. Lynn gave many presentations about biomimicry to management and staff before suggesting the idea of using biomimicry to solve an environmental challenge. This work to prepare and engage managers and employees in the possibilities offered by the biomimicry approach. While very time-consuming, Lynn's effort paid off by getting buy-in and excitement from most employees at OSMP. In a stroke of luck, the agency had decided to hire an engineer, and because of Lynn's efforts, the interview included questions to prospective employees about their ethics and interest in innovative solutions. The department hired Kelly right before the design charrette, and we were able to meet with her several times to explain our approach and get her buy-in and suggestions. Her enthusiasm for the project also served to change the mindset of several old-time employees who thought that the way they had already done things was just fine. When bringing this new approach to a group of people who have been working in an area for a long time, one barrier that must be recognized and overcome is the tendency for these employees to defend their current approach. In this case, damage left by the flood was just the leverage that Lynn needed. Employees could see and feel the negative effects resulting from the old way of doing things. So for OSMP, the agency was connected to the natural world, had a credible longtime champion for the biomimicry approach. The new engineer brought her credibility, expertise, and interest in innovation, and the time was right due to the recent disaster for the agency to accept this new approach. So in this case, all factors aligned, and still it was not easy to bring biomimicry to the solution space. So the scoping phase is the place where you identify the challenge and the project constraints. So hopefully you and your team have already done this. This revealed a number of design constraints at OSMP. Meeting with interested employees who heard about biomimicry, Lynn held several work sessions to get input on what challenge to try as a pilot. Her criteria was she wanted a viable project that could be used as a demonstration site for visitors, a project timeline that allowed for in-depth thinking to discover a solution. She wanted a project that could be replicated, and she wanted also to include education and involvement with the OSMP employees so that they could think like this for the project next time. Previously, employees had brainstormed a list of possible sites and identified the pros and cons of each, matching them to the list of project criteria. Based on the project ideas and list of constraints, OSMP decided that the challenge to address was resurfacing of roads and trails that were damaged in the flood. So the functions we identified were: how does nature maintain shape under forces of shear and compression? How does nature shed water? And how does nature enhance infiltration? Because these are the function a road or trail surface provides. The next step was to ask, how does nature do this? Because the function always needs to be a verb, because it is an action that nature is taking, and so humans want to take the same action. So in the discover phase of the project started with the biologist and biomimic Karen Allen, facilitating 2 brainstorm sessions with interested OSMP staff scientists to generate a list of as many local organisms, processes, or ecosystem patterns as possible that perform the identified functions. This was done via lengthy conference calls with OSMP staff as they are knowledgeable about how local organisms behave. The real challenge in the discover phase is to find organisms that perform the selected functions. If you don't have this kind of biological support for your discover phase, here's some additional places your team can look to discover the organisms that perform the functions well in the ecosystem you're working with. So you can look at documentaries about nature, go to nature centers, look in books, journals, or really just ask biologists, as was done in this example. National parks or protected areas have biologists on staff who really understand that ecosystem. And also you can bring in the traditional ecological knowledge that tribal members obtain and know. Again, Sheridan Cook, the EPA intern, can help you. And here's her contact information again, and it's also provided in the homework. So here's some additional tips on finding genius organisms during the discover phase. You can ask who here is well adapted to that condition. For example, for Team Communicate, you could ask what organism's life depends on good communication. Your selection criteria then needs to be focused more about what strategies are more relevant to your particular challenge. So again, for Team Communicate, you might want to ask, how does the organism assure accurate or long-distance communication, if that's what you want to achieve? You could ask what kind of organisms might need to specifically adapted to this condition. For example, as Matt brought out for Team Disturbandants, what organisms survive where water availability is not constant? It comes and goes. You can also look in similar habitats in other parts of the world, and more often than not, there's an equivalent creature in that habitat. So Team Disturbandants could find ideas from organisms that live in India, for example, and see if these strategies could inform humans in North America, because India has times of high water monsoon and times of dryness. So in the discover phase for the OSMP, we found 75 ways that nature prevents deformation. We found 60 ways that nature creates a waterproof barrier, and 50 ways that nature enhances infiltration. This list is fairly extensive because we had the resources and the scientists at the OSMP agency to help us. We don't expect that your team will uncover this many for your challenge. The biologists on the team vetted the research tables for patterns and grouped together like strategies. Then the project team and the self-selected OSMP staff voted on their top strategies for each function. Another approach is to look at what kind and how much information is available from each of the organisms and select organisms that have the most available information about how the function is achieved in nature. The project team eliminated enhanced infiltration as a function to move to the next phase of the project, since OSMP prefers to use vegetation to enhance infiltration, and the team wanted to use their limited contract dollars to dive deeper into the other two functions. These organisms were selected because they were great at performing the selected function, they resided in the local ecosystem, and they were organisms that could be easily identified by local residents. The team selected 4 strategies for prevent deformation and 3 strategies for shed water. As an engineer on this project, I didn't get involved very much during the discover phase. The project team brought me in when questions arose that pertained to the outcome, and it would be unusual if you had an engineer on your team who was skilled at or had a desire to conduct biological research. I've included the link for this report on your homework sheet in case you want to look at it in more detail. It's a really interesting case study. So just to review the biomimicry framework, how we integrate biology into design, we call it IBD. There's the scoping phase, the behind-the-scenes preparation or legwork that you've already done. You're now entering the discover phase where you explore research to find organisms who perform your selected function. Then we move on to the creating phase, which is the glamorous stage of design, and options are explored, and that's where your team would brainstorm your solutions. some of that can be done during the in-person session. And then finally, we'll use life's principles, which we'll go over next webinar, to determine if the goals and the metrics of the natural design have been met. A very simple description of the design process would be to proceed through scoping, discovering, creating, and evaluation. This unrealistic route implies that when one phase is finished, the designer moves to the next phase. Projects are really not this simple. In reality, design is more fluid, and these categories of scoping, discovering, and evaluating and creating are not a set of steps with instructions, but the different components that need to happen through the design process. While there is a path in this process, in reality the steps are not done in isolation, but usually involve back and forth. There's another method that's sometimes used in biomimicry where we have biology to design methodology. And in this method, which we're not using for this workshop, but you would find unique natural models, you would abstract the deep design principles, and then you would identify potential applications. So you're not really looking to solve a problem, you're looking for great inspiration from nature in your attempts to invent a new bio-inspired product, process, or process design. Then you would play in design, and you'd integrate life's principles, evaluate, and thank nature for inspiration. So are there any questions about the scoping and discover phase? Speak up if you have a question about that, or type it in the chat box. Well, let's move on to the focus of the next phase, which is called abstracting the design principles. After you have identified an acceptable suite of possibilities by accessing biological literature, by working with Sheridan, and by researching the biological literature as a team, or by observing nature, the most important step follows. Biology by itself is interesting, but if you were just to hand that over to a design team, most designers wouldn't know what to do with it. So an additional step of translation is now necessary. When you read a case study, the creative process seems easy and obvious, but the emulation of a natural strategy with a human solution requires an understanding of the biology, a translation to design principles, and then a good dose of creativity. And we call this phase abstracting. So abstracting step includes two components: distilling the biological mechanism or strategy, translating them into design principles. And this is how the organism performs the function, and then translating them into principles that can be understood by any discipline. Abstracting is one of the most critical components of practicing biomimicry, and also one of the most difficult. Reading a scientific paper does not always send the reader to a sketchbook to draw out an amazing new application. So let's look at an example. This is the electric eel. So the first stage of abstracting is often quite technical. It's uncovering the biological mechanism of what is happening, and it must be understood in as much detail as possible. The mechanism is the most detailed look at the natural phenomena. Think of the mechanism as how the strategy works. Strategy is how the function is achieved. The function is what nature is doing. So in this case, the function, what nature is doing, is hunting prey. The strategy, how the function is achieved, is that the eel releases an electric charge into the water to stun its prey. The mechanism, which is how the strategy works, it uses ion pump to create a charge separation across the cell membrane. Mechanisms occur on the level of shape, process, or interactions with the environmental system as a whole. Remember, the best biomimicry designs mimic the form, process, and ecosystem in which the organism resides. The level of detail necessary to properly translate the mechanism into a design principle varies depending on the application, but with practice you'll learn to figure out how to go as deeply as you need to go. For the challenges identified by our challenge teams in this workshop, you need to abstract the strategies from the organisms who perform your function. Since we are not developing complex designs or products, but rather looking for innovative strategies, a deep dive into the mechanism may not be required. From your own knowledge and experience, take one or two of the strategies you find from nature on performing your function and look at the mechanism nature uses to see if a deep dive into the biology will help you solve your challenge. The design principle is the idea that can be emulated in design. A mechanism can sometimes be directly copied, such as the example for the Pax fan motor blade used to mix water, but usually the constraints on your particular natural example will not be exactly the same as those in the project, so direct imitation seldom represents the best emulation. Consider the following opportunity. When faced with the challenge of natural ventilation in a building, prairie dog tunnels might provide an inspiration. Despite the length of their tunnels, the shape of the tunnels and the openings help ensure that all spaces are adequately ventilated with fresh air. A direct copying of the mechanism would take their shapes and build them into ducts in the building to ventilate the building. However, exact copying of their shapes may not yield the best results for increased air movement in a building, since the prairie dog tunnels and openings serve multiple functions. In addition to air conditioning, these tunnels must also provide safe passage, a quick and easy entry, a perch for predator walking, and a safeguard to keep groundwater from entering and flooding the tunnel. So in this case, if you were going to copy some of the strategies that you learned from the prairie dog to ventilate your building that would be hopefully located in a prairie environment, you might use some of the principles like the tunnel openings are of different size and elevation in specific relationship to each other to catch the prevailing winds. The openings are directed in such a way that they mirror and parallel the prevailing winds. An accurate distillation of the mechanism is important to tease out the details of how the organism's constraints and purposes are similar to those of the project. Teasing out the critical elements of the mechanism and then testing them will help determine if the natural model's effectiveness at different scales and contexts will help you solve your problems. So one organism doesn't always equal one design principle. Sometimes the strategy actually involves elements of form, process, and system. And usually one strategy meets multiple functions. And this is actually one of life's principles, multifunctional design. As a result, distilling and translating a mechanism can yield multiple design principles. A design principle, like a function, lingers in neutral territory that does not belong exclusively to any discipline, such as biology, engineering, or business. The next step of abstracting is the translation from the biological mechanism to a design principle. A design principle captures that essence of the biological strategy and translates it in such a way that it is biologically accurate, but devoid of confusing biological jargon. Think of it as saying exactly the same thing, but without any obvious connection to biology. can a mechanism be described in a way that is usable to designers who may not know any of the scientific terms, yet not lose any of the important aspects required for a successful mechanism? The translation stage requires an understanding of all parts of the mechanism, what is happening in the natural model, plus the how and why that goes with that example. A trained biologist at the design table specializes in this kind of translation, but it's a skill that any dedicated practitioner of biomimicry can develop over time with a concerted effort. It definitely takes practice, but a good translation leads to more effective emulation. So let's look at a few abstracting examples from the OSMP case study. So the organism in this case is the western meadowhawk dragonfly. And this dragonfly in its wing construction is very good at deforming and regaining its shape. The mechanism is that resin deforms when stretched, then releases this energy once the tension is eased, returning to its original undeformed shape. So again, the abstracted design principle is taking that mechanism and taking out all the biological references. So the design principle in this case becomes a protein-based elastic material deforms under tension and regains its original shape when tension is released. So in the request for proposal for a new road surface for OSMP, we can ask engineers to select a product that has these characteristics. It may be an existing product that has not yet been used as a trail or road surface, for example. So it opens up the design space. Another example is the ponderosa pine. So the function here is uniformly distribute stress. The mechanism is to distribute stress uniformly. Trees add wood at points of greatest mechanical load. And the abstracted design principle becomes add materials at points of greatest mechanical load to uniformly distribute stress. This seems like an obvious principle for any road or trail surface. But by recognizing that nature uses this principle successfully, it serves to better connect trail and road designers, engineers, and local residents, user of the roads and trails, to nature's genius by saying, we're doing this in this road construction, but by the way, nature also uses this principle when designing for stress. So here's a more, excuse me a minute. Here's a more recent example from the CU Biomimicry, Boulder Biomimicry Club. So the University of Colorado is working to address the student design challenge issued by the Biomimicry Institute. The group decided that there were so many things wrong with the food system that in order to get humans to focus on changing the system, we need to reconnect humans to their food system and change their mindset. The club identified the need for a network that will connect people to their local food sources and to connect local food growers together as well. They found inspiration by looking at the mutualistic relationship between mycorrhizal fungi and other plants such as trees. By looking at how information is transferred, one of the club members, Ted Thayer, discovered that the messages and nutrients pass from cell to cell without a controlling head of communications. Abstracting this mechanism into a design principle becomes the message sends itself. So this is added to the list of ideas they'll use when developing a solution to their food system challenge. So the challenge is to recreate a mutualistic relationship between humans and their food system. The biologized question, which is the function, how does nature form a mutualistic relationship and a network of communication? One of their inspiring organisms is the mycorrhizal fungi. So they can ask the question, how does the network of communication work? and it works through cellular exchange. The information is passed from one cell to the other. So that understanding that wouldn't really help you design a new network for communication on food among humans, but actually looking at the important deep pattern is that the message sends itself with low energy processes. So it becomes another way to look at how to solve the problem. Is there a way they can connect these disparate users and food growers in a way that the message sends itself? Now they're ready to use this design principle with a myriad of others that they've discovered to design a network. This abstracted design principle may or may not inform the final design, but it's an idea to think about. So Diana was going to give some overview of a bio brainstorm on how nature learns. Diana, are you able to get on?
Can you hear me?
Yes, wonderful.
Oh boy, I'm so sorry. I have been listening the whole time with being mute. So
okay.
So what I wanted to talk about was I was on a team and we did a bio brainstorm about how does nature learn, and we looked in the biological literature. And we found many examples of learning in nature, but we wanted to separate out instinctive reaction like running from a predator or running from fire. We wanted to separate that out and just focus on examples where there's actually teaching and learning happening in nature. And we found lots of examples in bacteria, in whales, meerkats, across taxa, rats, guppies, all sorts of examples. I thought I'd talk a little bit here about tandem running ants. And tandem running ants, like any ant, and also like bees, they use social insects, and they live in highly organized societies, and they have clear divisions of labor. And they have some pretty important decisions to make: where to find food, should they move their nest or their colony. And they've developed this efficient communication system. They call it cooperative communication, where they actively share information with others, and then they bring, through this information sharing, they bring about this cohesive collective action. And so tandem running is actually a communication system that these ants use to share information. So there's this image or this drawing on the right that shows the number one tandem running ant. The ant with the green pathway is the follower, and the ant on the darker line is the leader. And so in tandem running, the process is there's a follower who follows the leader from their nest in search of a food source. In this case, on the right, they're looking for strawberries. So the follower follows the leader, and sort of like a train-the-trainer approach. And then so the next process would be that the ant who was the follower would maybe go out and do some exploration on its own. And by this individual explanation shown in the middle line, or the blue line, number 2, so that ant is augmenting its experience. It had the first experience being a follower, now it's doing some individual exploration. So it's gaining more information, and you can see that its route to the food source is a little more direct. And then the third process, so the follower can now become a leader, but they're even a better leader because they have been a follower, or the train-the-trainer. They went out and did some individual exploration, and then now are having a pretty direct route from the colony to the food source. And some of the other information we found in reading about the biology of these tandem running ants, in order to make a decision, the riskier the decision, the larger the quorum the ants need to make that decision. So finding a particular food source is, it's a pretty important decision, but actually locating a new site for your colony is a very important decision. So it would take more ants going towards this tandem running, or communicating that, yes, site A is the location where we want to move. It would require a greater quorum for those ants to make that decision. And also from the biology, we learned that as the ants are involved in exploring, so they, not just being a passive follower, but actually actively engaged in exploring their world, that increases their engagement in the process and results in additional exploration. And so, reading about this biology, and we saw that tandem running is an effective and efficient way to transfer information throughout the colony. Many ants are doing the same process all the time, and it leads to timely resource decisions because you're bringing in all this information learned from others, from the follower to the leader, and then adding the individual experience. So you're maximizing the efficiency of information flow, and it results in kind of a cohesive colony behavior. And so from that, we abstracted some design principles. One is upfront investments of time and energy into exploring options yield greater and more sustainable results. Another is combine acquired information with direct experience for best results. So going from being the follower to your exploration leads to number 3 there with the most direct line to the food source. A third abstracted design principle is group learning combined with experience increases engagement and leads to improved solutions. And then the flip side of that might be passive audiences retain less information and are less likely to be problem solvers because they're just sort of passively receiving information. Excel at coordination by optimizing information flow. So a better chance of coordinating if you have accurate and timely information. And then our last one that we came up with from the tandem running ants was for decisions with greater potential consequences, maximize stakeholder involvement for better outcomes. And that goes back to the quorum. The larger quorum is needed for riskier decisions. So that was an example from a bio brainstorm project. Hello? Hello?
Hello?
Hi, Diana.
Hi.
It looks
Marie?
like, Marie, it looks like you've muted yourself. It says attendee can't be unmuted. Oh, is that you, Marie?
Oh, it looks like Marie is disconnected. If someone can advance the slide, I can talk until she gets back on.
Marie?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, I accidentally disconnected while I was unmuting myself, so sorry about that delay. So thanks, Diana, for that overview, and let me go through the homework for this week. So this week, we really want your challenge teams to start accessing the biological information through the discovery phase. Be sure to contact Sheridan and see how and when she can help you discover those biological examples and really set up your work process. Who's going to access what kind of biological information, and how are you going to organize that so that you can look at it to see the deep patterns and principles in that information. I've uploaded an abstract worksheet for your information just to get better at abstracting design principles. And I've also included a file called Cheat Sheet, Don't Look at This First, which gives the answers. So you can practice abstracting design principles, which I've indicated is one of the most significantly hard parts of the biomimicry methodology. If you care to, read the OSMP case study because it outlines the process from beginning to end. It's a very enjoyable case study project, and we've suggested an Eyesight for you to do. There's really nothing to submit at this time. So what I want to do for just the last few minutes is just to go through one more example of abstracting design principles, and then if we have time, we'll go back and see if Diana can give us the Columbia wood products example. So this is a beetle, and actually it's able to achieve a striking white coloration without the use of pigments. And so the function that we actually have in this particular one is what is nature doing? And it's actually creating white color. The strategy, how the function is achieved, is the white is achieved through structure. The beetles create brilliant white color structurally with their ultra-thin scales that contain sparsely packed fibers with voids that cause light to scatter. You can see this illustrated in this design. So the design principle, when we translate it into design language, is that microscopic, ultra-thin, interconnected filaments simultaneously scatter light to create brilliant white. So you can notice in this design principle how the important mechanisms are included, such as their microscopic fibers, they're ultra thin, these fibers are interconnected, and they scatter light. So if you wanted to create white using this design principle, you would have to make sure that you understood all of those. So that gives us an overview of what we need to do. Let's see. We can go back to the one on Columbia wood products here. Diana, do you have time to go over this case study with us?
Sure. If you want to move it back to that slide, that'd be great.
I think I just did. Can you see it?
Okay. Oh, I'm sure it's probably coming.
I didn't.
Okay, last month when we were talking about deriving inspiration from nature, we were talking about where to get ideas from about reflecting light, and I promised to share an example about the Columbia forest products and the blue mussels. Oh, there we go. So everyone should see the slide now. So this is an interesting example because it's an example of finding a strategy in nature and then looking for a human application, as well as having a human need and looking to biology for answers. So it's kind of a full circle project or example. So the picture on the left shows blue mussels, and there was a researcher in Oregon who was really interested in adhesives, and he was trying to figure out a way to make adhesives that did not contain a number of volatile organic compounds. And so he wanted to use life-friendly chemistry with adhesives, and he's been struggling with this and going down, about conducting his research. And then one day he was out on the Oregon coast and he noticed these blue mussels attached very firmly to these wet rocks, and they, and being subjected to periodic wave pressure. So they've got some kind of adverse conditions if you want to stick to something. It's wet and there's these periodic forces that are strong. So he had this adhesive problem in his mind, and he took a couple of them back, which if he only harvested them for their adhesive, it would be bioharvesting, which is not biomimicry. But he took them back to study the way they make their adhesive and the protein structure of their adhesive. So how do they stick? And he, after some research and investigation, he found that there's a very similar protein structure in the soybean. And soybeans, we can certainly raise raise that protein in a sustainable way. And so he developed this adhesive based on the strategy and the mechanism of the blue mussel, using the protein, soybean protein structure. And then he couldn't find anyone who was interested in this great idea that he had. And so he was trying to shop it around and wasn't having a lot of luck. And so meanwhile, there was a, back at Columbia Forest Products, there was some interest in really completely greening their product line. And they, just a second. There you go. Sorry. I'm back. So meanwhile, back at Columbia Forest Products, they were interested in greening their line, and they were careful about sustainably harvesting their wood, but they still were using VOCs in their adhesive to make their veneer wood products. And they just hadn't been able to come up with any viable alternatives. So that they were certainly interested in this. They had this need. And then, as it would happen, one day the researcher who had this great bio-based adhesive was giving a talk at the university, and in the audience was somebody from the Columbia Forest Products who was so excited about this non-VOC adhesive. So at the end of the lecture, he went up to talk to the researcher and said, "We have to talk." And so it was this example of a researcher finding this cool strategy in biology, in nature, figuring out exactly how it works, and then matching that up with the identified need, in this case by Columbia Forest Products. And the result is this adhesive that Columbia Forest Products use called Pure Bond, and they've been able to, over time, eliminate the VOCs from their product line. So it's a pretty cool biology to design and design to biology example.
Wonderful. Well, thanks, Diana, for sharing that. I know we're a little bit over, but I'll open it up for any questions people have before we end this webinar. So this example from Diana was a good one where you first identify a really unique strategy and design principle in nature, and then you find a product that will accept that needs that solution. Questions? Comments? Kendra, you have a question? Go ahead. What's the difference between function and strategy? So the function is what you want to do, and it's always a verb. I want to regulate water. I want to communicate a message. So it's a verb. The strategy is how nature does that. Nature communicates, the good example that Diana gave about how ants communicate and learn from each other is how it's done. So that's the difference between the mechanism, and then the mechanism is the details of the strategy. So it's a deeper dive into how it's done. The example we gave for the brilliant white color from the beetle, the function would be to create white color because that's what you want to do. Maybe you want to create it on a fabric or something. The strategy is that it's created through structure. And then the mechanism describes the details of how that structure is achieved. And so in their case, they have filaments that are ultra thin, and they're sparsely packed with voids in it. And so then translating that into a design principle just takes that strategy and mechanism and converts it to non-biological language. Okay, well, thanks for asking. And just give either Diana or I a call or an email if you have questions, because abstracting is really the hardest part of the biomimicry methodology. Other questions? Well, sorry that we, go ahead, someone on the line?
Kind of a quick question. This is Jane. And it's probably not an easy, simple answer, but can you give an example of about, say for the mussels, about how many, or one of the other examples, about how many types of research papers did you look through before you found sort of the organism that answers a question, helps answer a question?
And that is really a good question, because sometimes it's very difficult to find how the organism does it, because a lot of researchers will just say, hey, this is really cool, penguins are able to desalinate water, end of story. So to really discover it's not how many, but how well the function and the mechanism is described in the literature. So sometimes for some functions, you'll find a lot of information. Like team disturbandets will probably find a lot of information about how nature manages excess water, because it's a problem that humans have been dealing with for a long time. Whereas another team might have a harder time finding research that tells how it's done. And so I would say the amount of biological information is how much you can get and the quality of it. So just keep looking. Sometimes you just find one or two articles, but it already tells you some really important design principles. And sometimes you need to find 10 articles before you really understand how the mechanism works.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's a good question. I would just also add that part of the challenge is often biological research isn't done according to function. It's done for some other, what are the reproductive strategies, something, this is water resistant, but it doesn't tell you how. Why is it resistant? What is the mechanism for creating this composite layer that actually is water resistant? So just hang in there, and sometimes you find you might find something in the tertiary literature that talks about something, and then that kind of clues you in that this is something that you might search for specifically on Google Scholar, and that will lead you to some papers. And so you have to try a bunch of different ways, but it's pretty fun.
Okay. Well, if you have any more questions, thanks, Diana. If you have more questions, just send an email or a phone message to Diana and I. Be sure to access Sheridan's help. She's there to help you. And we'll end the session now. Thanks, everybody, for attending.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.